A few videos back, I mentioned DanDan as a good way to start a player off learning Magic. And a few players mentioned how much they love the format in the comments. But I imagine most people saw this weird card and were simply confused. So I'll explain the DanDan format here. But first, if you like videos like this, consider subscribing. Thanks. DanDan is a very simple format. It's 1v1, there is no ban list, no card restriction, so you can have 20 copies of any card you want in the deck. Every card ever printed is legal, including silver bordered or whatever else. It's 80 cards in a deck. 20 life for both players. Mulligan rules are normal London mulligans, except if you ever have 1 or 0 lands in hand, you may reveal it and then redo that mulligan. So if you mulligan once, and then the next time you have 0 lands, you get to go to 6 again for free. And both players share a deck and graveyard. So you only need one DanDan deck between you and a friend. Traditionally, DanDan is a mono blue mid-range mirror. It usually has 10 copies of this creature DanDan as the only way to deal damage. And the rest of the deck is top deck manipulation, with cards like Portent and Brainstorm or Mental Note. These are really important for DanDan because since you and your opponent share a deck, manipulating the top of the library is going to affect what your opponent draws as well as you. These are the main staples of the format. Trying to set up a Brainstorm such that your opponent draws an island and you draw a DanDan is really powerful. But instant speed draw effects like Mental Note or any other cantrip cycling effect you want can mess with that. You can also use cards like Magical Hack to cause DanDan to sacrifice itself by altering the text of Island to a different basic land type. You can also play counterspells that allow you to pay mana to stop them, or counterspells that put things on top of the library. This creates an interesting game of tapping mana, baiting your opponent. A DanDan deck is much like a cube. You want to test and change cards over time and see what works. You don't even need to use DanDan or be in blue. I made a mono green DanDan list, using Rusted Slasher as the only way to do damage. The deck has cards like Reclaim and Once and Future to mess with the top of your deck, plus various scry effects and the Slasher itself allowing you to sacrifice the Wellsprings to instant speed shuffle can also be a form of top deck manipulation. But if you sacrifice the Wellsprings, you lose a way to protect the Slasher from removal. So there's a cost to messing with the top deck. Plus, I added a few copies of Natural Obsolescence as hard removal since you can't regenerate that. And Lost in the Woods can add some fun uses for the top deck manipulation. The mana base is also full of scry lands and cycle lands for more ways to mess with the top of the deck. The deck will be linked in the comments below for you to check out. It's super cheap too, like under 30 bucks. A buddy of mine made a mono red DanDan list, using cards like Flamewake Phoenix and Firewing Phoenix. Since both players share a graveyard, it creates an interesting game of chicken where you want to kill your opponent's creatures, but make sure they don't have a way to get it back, and that you have a way to get it back from the graveyard. And red pump effects like Ancestral Anger are really fascinating, since using one can help you push for more damage, but it also means your opponent's next Ancestral Anger will be more powerful. One key thing I learned when playing DanDan and testing out is that damage numbers are important. So let's say the only way you have to deal damage is a 4-1. You're going to need 5 hits to deal the 20 damage, meaning if you added Lava Spike to the deck, it would essentially be useless, since taking your opponent down to 17 still means you need 5 hits, and unless you draw 2 Lava Spikes, it essentially has no purpose. So keep in mind damage numbers. But all of this is still just the very tip of the iceberg. I've been brewing up other DanDan lists as well. In black, you can play cards like Misinformation to mess with the top of the deck and force your opponents to draw something they might not want, or cards like Tortured Existence to swap creatures in and out of the yard, and combining this with Madness creatures can be really fun. Cabal Therapy is also a really interesting card in this format, since you can just guess what your opponent has. You are playing the same deck after all, but then casting Cabal Therapy means your opponent on their turn could sack a creature to flash it back and make you discard something. In white, you can play cards like Lapse of Certainty to counter a threat and put it on top of the deck for you to use. Unexpectedly Absent is another interesting card that lets you mess with your opponent's draw or set up a card for you to draw. You could also build a dredge deck and try and mill your opponent out, or just play a mill deck and see who can get there first. Maybe even a tribal deck with changelings and a bunch of random lords. I've seen decks with no creatures, just burn spells, life gain, and skullcrack effects to stop the life gain. The possibilities are endless, so get brewing. I will link the classic mono blue list and my mono green list and my friend's mono red list in the description for you to try out. So if you've never heard of DanDan before, give it a try. Hopefully I've convinced you, and it's a really cheap format to get into. If you already play DanDan, please share your list in the comments below. I'm super curious. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe for more.